12:45, so I'll keep no, exactly. I'll keep letting people in as they come in. But if you'd like to get started,
that's great. Thanks, Sam. No time like the present. I appreciate that. A lot of you have been online for quite a lot of this morning, so we'll try and keep the energy levels up. I think it's all been pretty inspiring. Everything certainly I've heard so far, both in the breakout sessions and what Charlie said, and the progress that Wind has made. So. Although COVID has made life very difficult in many respects, one of the things I think that has happened is it's given us all a lot of time to think, and if anything, inspired us to not just make it better, but to try and bring a sense of urgency to all the work that we've been doing. And I think that's been reflected in the strategy proposals and in the reaction that we've had from everybody. So thank you again for all those who've responded to the survey and got involved, and we'll follow up with more of that later. You will have heard from a couple of our directors, Mary Brooks, Angela Bryant, as part of the breakout sessions, and indeed Mark Luntley, obviously, who's crossed both boards as a director. By the end of this meeting, you will have heard from all of our directors, and I'm proposing to say as little as I can. I think to start with, we should just go through the process, Sam, which I think is on the next slide, if that's okay, just for a reminder, but also for those who've just joined. So the default position is that cameras and microphones are turned off. That's just to save bandwidth and avoid any disruption. The AGM is being recorded, so we don't miss anything as much as anything else. If you have questions, and I would encourage questions, could you please, as a preference, direct them through the chat function at the bottom of your stream, and we'll try and answer them either as we go along or at the end of the various presentations. I am proposing to propose the resolutions, but I would ask if people could be fingers on the button to raise your hand through the participants or reactions column, so that we can take them as seconded as we go through. And then most of the resolutions are coming towards the end of the meeting, and there will be a voting poll procedure to go through. Sam, we've got a test one of that people can just try out.
I do indeed. It should be coming up on your screens now. So
Brilliant.
We're just looking to see if you have already voted ahead of the AGM, then please let us know. If you haven't, then that's fine. It's just to give us a rough idea of numbers. Also, at the same time, if you are a Westmill Wind member, we ask that, obviously, if you might not be able, we ask that you abstain from any of the voting, just so that we don't get any double counts. But I'll leave this open for another 15 or 10 or so seconds, just so we get a rough number. We seem to only have about 47 people who voted. 49. 3, 2, 1. Fantastic. So that should mean that we're having around 23 people who are voting in this here. So thank you to the people who have voted ahead. Much appreciated. And yeah, I will.
Brilliant. Thank you, Sam. I mean, I believe, just to put it in context, I think we've had about 225 people who've voted specifically for the resolutions in advance, and there were 99 people who appointed me as chair of the meeting to vote on their behalf. So yeah, we're getting up to 400 people voting, which is fabulous in terms of, we are a democratic organisation and a member-led organisation. So without your votes, we can't do that. So thank you for that. If we can close that poll, Sam, the agenda for the meeting itself is pretty similar. So we've got a question from John Twiddell saying that the trial vote didn't show up for him.
Okay, I'll just relaunch it now, John. Can you let me know if it comes up for you? If you have, please just disregard if you've already voted in this. John, has that come up for you now? If you could let me know in the chat. There's some people voting, so I'm going to take it as, yep. Thank you, John, very much for that. It might be that you just joined in a little bit late or something like that, but I'll end that polling now and we'll get back into the sort of agenda.
That's great, thank you. We're hoping, I mean, Zoom seems to be working pretty well. We're hoping there won't be any technical hitches in this. There's Sam and the team at FX behind the scenes working on sort of the polling and the questions and picking up the questions that go through. If my system goes down and I can't log in, then I think Mark Luntley has very kindly said that he would take over as chair, but hopefully that won't happen. And the agenda will be pretty similar to what we've had in the past. I'd like to give an opportunity for Martin to talk about the performance of the site, for Nina to elaborate a bit more on the community funding, which I know is an area that people are interested in going forward. Andy Crawford to go through the finances, and it's been an excellent year. We've split out the resolutions a little bit more than we have done in the past. That was partly because members actually asked us to do that. And also because having taken advice from outside lawyers, Wrigley's, about sort of how we should best operate as a cooperative, that was the advice that they gave us. And then we have some board reappointments sort of coming up towards the end. There are some things that are very much sort of top of our minds at the moment, which we're not dealing with at this AGM, and I just want to sort of alert you to those as much as anything else. The first thing, and Ryan mentioned it in the wind meeting, is that we've put a lot of effort and worked with a lot of people at Unity, Cooperative Energy, Octopus to try and get the trading dividend up and running. Thank you to all of those who've joined the pilot, because that has been hugely helpful in giving us feedback. The people who have already are on that system will now have become entitled to their first payment, which should come through on your electricity bills in July or August. We will be operating a webinar with all the relevant people who are involved in doing this to answer questions that you may have had, deal with any problems that people experienced, and actually to encourage as many members as possible to join the dividend going forward. We have tried very hard to make sure that the price is competitive. Electricity prices are rising, so if you're currently on a fixed deal, it might make sense to wait a little bit, but we hope that when that deal comes to an end, you will join the trading dividend. And we also are hopeful that there'll be some kind of electric vehicle option, which I think is pretty key to members who are sort of more forward looking and have already got their electric vehicles. So there will be more news coming on that after this meeting. There will also be more consultation with members on sort of what we do with our capital repayment and more generally on our capital structure. We are scheduled to do another capital repayment later this year, possibly early next year, as we have done in 2014 and 2017. There's a whole load of issues that sort of go into that in terms of what capital needs we might have, how do we encourage new members to join, how do we make sure that's fair between the existing members who took a bigger risk at the start and new members coming in. So that is something that we will very much be sort of working with members to build a consensus on going forward. And it also sort of is another area we'll be working increasingly closely with Westmill Wind. The third thing we will let you have after the meeting is a bit more detail about the results of the survey and the member survey, which I know Angela will have gone through to some extent in her in the strategy breakout session, and will allude to them in some of the resolutions as we come through here. But some of the feedback from this meeting, as well as more detail on the survey results. And at that point, I think I propose to go into the business of the meeting. And the first resolution is to approve the minutes of last year's meeting in June last year. Just checking, Josh, are there any questions on that at the moment? Doesn't look like it. So I'm proposing that the minutes of the 2020 annual general meeting be approved. Could I ask somebody to finger on the button, raise your hand to second that?
Anthony Woolhouse,
thank you very much for your speed off the mark on that one. And Sam, if you could open the poll.
Yep, it's coming up, should be up in front of you all now.
Brilliant, thank you.
So I'm going to give you about 15 or 20 seconds to vote. So 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Last chance if you haven't already. And a couple. We'll keep it there. Okay, we'll end polling there. And I'll just share those results with everyone. So you should see large number of people all for that. So 19 for and 3 abstains and no against. And if we go on to the next slide, you should see there the votes taken before the AGM.
So that's a resolution, I think, fairly clearly passed. So thank you, everybody, for that one. That's exactly what you don't want in the middle of a chairing. Apologies for that. So over to Martin. Martin, it's been a great year, and Martin will go through in more detail how that's looked. And over to you, Martin. Thank you.
Thanks, Tom. Yeah, so I'm Martin Allman. I've been a board member at Westmill Solar since June 2015, and I take a lead on behalf of the board to work with our operations and maintenance provider, BSR, as well as our asset manager, Arena. Sam, I'm assuming you're going to drive the slides for me.
I am. Just as a note, apologies that there are grey blocks coming up in front of people. It's part of my ability as hosting at the same time, but
okay,
I'll try and keep those to a minimum.
No worries. So once again, I think I've got one of the easiest jobs at the AGM, and that's really because once again, I'm delighted to report very positive performance of the solar park over the year, actually generating a record amount of electricity over the course of the year. And the graph that you can see shows the month-on-month generation figures for 2020 in that dark blue color. And the yellow is the average monthly generation over the previous 7 years, from 2013 to 2019. And what we see is that 2020 saw this record generation of 5,567 megawatt hours of electricity, and mainly due to, or in large part due to the high irradiation that you may remember back in that first period of lockdown in March and then April and May. And aside from being a record year, May was also, with 875,000 kilowatt hours generated, also a record level of generation compared with any other single month that we've recorded. So a fantastic year, which is going to be reflected in what Andy has to say later, I'm sure. Next slide, please. So the second graph here compares the annual generation of 2020 in blue again, and we can see that last year the generation was over 5% higher than the 5,271 megawatt hours generated in 2019, which in itself was a very good year. That's the orangey bar there. And we can also see we smashed the old annual record in 2014 of 5,393 megawatt hours, shown here in green. And the final comparison, that yellow bar, showing that average over the previous 7 years, significantly lower than the new 2020 record that we're now out to beat. So the message is that the solar park is consistently performing well month on month, in spite of getting a bit older, but obviously also due to the greater irradiation that we had. But generation is substantially ahead of the forecast at the time of the share offer, and above the average generation figures over previous years. Next slide, please, Dan. So what does all this wonderful clean green electricity generation mean? Well, aside from the financial returns, which Andy will dig into, and the greater community benefits that Nina will expand on, that we're able to offer. Well, in 2020, Westmill Solar generated the equivalent consumption of over 1,900 UK households, avoiding something like 1,200 tons of CO2 emissions. And so once again, each member has effectively offset all of their carbon emissions from their electricity usage. Well done. In 2020, we agreed On the operations and maintenance side, we agreed to extend the contract that we have with our principal service partners, RENA, our asset manager, and British Solar Renewables, who are our operations and maintenance provider, who do the work on site to keep everything in working order. We also extended the warranty on the 7 SMA inverter stations for a further 10 years. Now that kicks in, I think, next month. And what this is about is giving us a guaranteed level of performance from the inverters, also a guaranteed supply of spare parts, really important. You know, these are not new bits of kit, but it means that we have those spare parts guaranteed, as well as the service support directly from SMA's engineers and service partners working alongside BSR to keep the inverter stations in good working order. And another important indicator of the performance of the solar park is this availability target. And we achieved our 99% availability target in every month of 2020, except in February, 98.2%, and in October, 98.4%. And worth noting that since the start of our contract with BSR as O&M provider in December 2017, we've achieved availability of more than 99.5%. So they're keeping the solar park online, keeping it performing through the reactive and the planned maintenance that they're carrying out. So what about the priorities for 2021? Well, all the time we're looking at new ways that we can be proactive in identifying performance and maintenance issues, which we can then seek to address and to improve on. And at the same time, there's always new technical developments that we can tap into, which our service providers can use to the benefit of the park, that we certainly didn't have a few years ago when we were looking at the O&M side of the solar park. And for example, last year, we carried out a thermographic drone survey of the park to identify possible degradation in the panels. And sure enough, we identified the effects of something called potential induced degradation, PID, which is a fairly common problem with solar panels of the age of those at Westmill. And it's a problem that if you don't catch it early, it can result in a fairly significant and rapid degradation in module performance over time. And so, having identified the issue through the survey, we're now able to take that remedial action to correct it and put it right. And that's going to be done with the installation of float controller devices which are installed alongside the inverters to reverse the PID impact and provide a long-lasting solution. So all the time, together with BSR and also with RENA's support, we're going to continue to look at new ways to keep the solar park performing well. So in closing, another fantastic year for Westmill Solar and our performance. Thank you.
Thank you, Martin. That's much appreciated, as indeed has all your work been over the year in terms of making sure that we're up to scratch and as well prepared as we can to keep the panels operating smoothly going forward. I haven't seen any questions specifically on that other than sort of one about March, April, May being, you know, was that less pollution or primarily sunshine, which I think is the answer. But has anybody else got any questions on chat before we move on?
And Tom, there was a question about the capital return. And whether
I'm leaving capital returns sort of out of this for now, but I'll get to that later. Thanks, Josh. So there's one from James in terms of how's 2021 been, which is a good question.
I mean, I can field in that, or Martin, you can as well, as it were.
Well, go ahead, Sam.
Yeah. So far, it's not been as production. Production hasn't been as sort of. We haven't generated as much electricity. I mean, the start of the year, again, that's due partly to the fact that last year, in sort of, as we said, April, May, June period, we had quite a balmy summer, or early summer, basically. So we're still on track to be keeping well above sort of the average of the last 6 or 7 years. but not so far as productive as 2020. But that could all change if we have a very, very nice summer.
Exactly. Keep our fingers crossed. We are unfortunately very weather dependent, but that's the way it is. If there are no other questions on that, then I think we'll move on to Nina, and one coming from John. What can you do apart from replacement of suspect panels? I mean, the potential degradation issue, I think that Martin was referring to, actually avoids us having to replace the panels.
Yeah. So we don't really. It can be fairly rare that we have to replace the panels with potential induced degradation. What the approach is to reverse the effects of PID by adding these devices which sit alongside each of the inverter units. So they're installed between the inverter and the PV modules, and effectively they raise the voltage during nighttime on the DC side, which creates a positive potential difference. And this reverses the degradation without having to replace the panels. So that's the real plus with this. Occasionally, very occasionally, we need to replace panels because of issues which could be about other damage where perhaps they've been cracked, whatever, but it's very rare. And we have a stock of panels on site that can just be swapped out as required by BSO as part of their reactive maintenance program.
Brilliant. That's great. Thank you, Martin. No other questions. Nina, do you want to go and elaborate on all the community funding work that you've been doing this year, you and indeed your group, because I want to give a special thanks to them. It's been a fabulous example of how members can get involved and help us do more. And there are various areas where we would love to extend that example. So anyway, Nina, over to you.
Right, thank you. Hello, everyone, again. So we're all doing our best Chris Whitty impersonations, aren't we? Next slide, please, Sam. So we are a cooperative, and we are guided by our cooperative principles. I know some of you can practically sing along to these now, but there's a full list in the annual report on page 7 if you want to remind yourself what they are. 3 of them particularly relevant to the community funding. So the obvious one is concern for community, and the detailed wording in there about what community benefit means also talks about sustainable development of communities. So that's where the sustainability comes in. But we also like to help out with education and training, and we like to work with other organisations, other cooperatives, but also other social enterprises, because often we find together we can achieve more with the money that we're each able to put in. So, but it's not just that. We're looking to have a benefit to the community. We are looking for some impact, or at least a good prospect of some impact. So we tend to look at that under 2 headings. The sustainability, most of us got into this because of climate change. So we're looking either directly something that's going to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and that's things like our community buildings energy audits, or when we helped put the solar panels on the Watchfield Village Hall roof some years ago. And there's indirect things, so that can be working with some of the other community groups to promote changes and sustainable lifestyles and that kind of thing. So we are looking specifically for things that need and deserve our help, but it's not just something that will make us feel warm and positive, and fuzzy. That's nice too, but we want to actually have a difference. And because we are a renewables, we are an energy generator, we also want to have an eye out for helping with fuel poverty. Now, our company secretary has a good line that actually fuel poverty is just poverty. But anyway, there's often a fuel angle to that. So, we're looking for those as well. So we also like to think if we can get our money to achieve a bit more, as I say, by partnering with others, or sometimes just by opening up the possibility of other funding, being part of something bigger so that more can be achieved, if we can leverage other funds, or just make the difference between something happening or not. Yeah. So that's what we're looking for. Next slide, please, Sam. Thank you. What do we mean by community? Well, over the years, we've developed this sort of ripple approach, if you like. We concentrate quite a lot of our funding in the local and regional area. So local, I don't have a strict definition of, but things on site, like we fund WeSet's work, things that they'll do with the local schools. That includes some that are just up the road, as well as some that are in the broader region. The region, for the purposes of community funding, we've got two parts of that. So there's our county, so anything that's in Oxfordshire, and within a 25-mile radius of the site. So that's not just bits of Oxfordshire, that's quite a chunk of Wiltshire, including the Swindon area. I know we have quite a lot of members there. And also bits of Berkshire and Gloucestershire will sort of come into that 25-mile circle. So that's sort of definition that we've settled on for various purposes. It works well with some of the partners we're working with as well. We do spend some money at national level. And one of the things that's come up both in the survey and in the breakout session this morning was the extent to which we might like to do more where something is local to our members, not necessarily local to the site. So I'm interested in views on that. If you'd like to maybe put some comments on the chat or send us an email afterwards. If there's a little cluster of members somewhere and there's a great local thing going on somewhere else, I don't see why we couldn't consider an application for some funding to support that if it matches all, ticks all our other boxes. What I don't want to do is open up a community grants program to the whole country. We haven't got the capacity to deal with a very large number of applications anyway. But also I want it to be, relevant to our members. You're the ones who decide what sorts of things you want us to spend the money on. And it does take quite a lot of due diligence, time and effort to check when we're going to award some money that it is actually a genuine not-for-profit organisation, guarding against fraud and so on. In our area, we're more likely to know organisations already, so it's easier to check up who it is we might be handing money to. Okay, so that's the sort of national level. Globally, we have again made a contribution to the work of Renewable World, who are helping relieve poverty in some very poor areas, for example, a big project in Nepal through solar panels. Next slide, please, Sam. So what's the benefit that we're sharing? We've been building up gradually, I guess, since the solar farm started about what we spend our money on, because we've been thinking, refining what our strategy is and what our criteria are, and being careful that we do want to achieve good impact and not just put money out there for something that sounds nice. So, historically, I could almost read this slide from the bottom up. At the beginning, we funded WeSet. There was Westmill Sustainable Energy Trust. That's the charity also funded by Wind and by their own donations. And they do the tours of the solar site. They work with the schools, but also other groups like Scouts and so on. They've produced some really excellent schools educational pack materials that you can see on their website now. Mike mentioned those earlier if you heard the WeSet update. So we started off just paying 1% of our turnover to them. That was about £20,000 to start with. It's now pretty consistently 25,000 or so. In fact, just to make everyone's lives easier, we've agreed that from 2021, we're going to make that a flat figure. We pay quarterly, so WeSet can plan and they know what they're getting. And it's been a bit of a faff to wait for the audited figures to come through to know exactly what the 1% turned into. So we're just going to change that to 25,000. So that was a great start, but quite early on, Westmill Solar members wanted to do more. The park was going great, doing much better than we'd perhaps hoped for. So we started expanding into other areas. We worked a bit with WeSet and Low Carbon Hub to spend on other things too. And more recently, as it's grown, we've brought that in-house. So we now have a sort of board discussion on this where we're leading rather than inviting only from other ideas from those other sources. So there was a big consultation and at the AGM discussions, everything. Some of you might have been in the focus groups. So we came up with that formula to link the community funding to the members' interest. So that was important because we don't want to commit a flat sum. If we have a spectacularly bad year unexpectedly, the members' interest will reduce, but the community funding would reduce down with it. So we're not over-promising, and there'd be money available for other things, like repairs and so on as needed. So we started with this 85-15 ratio. Every £85 that was declared as members' interest would generate £15 to go towards community funding. And the first slice of that would be to reset, and then the rest was for other things. I think last year we started talking about a slightly different ratio. So the proposal now, and you're getting to vote separately on this, rather than just as part of accepting the accounts, is to do a bit more by just making that 80-20 rather than 85-15. We do have a lot of good prospects and projects that are out there. We couldn't fund all of the grants that we wanted to, that were really worthy of funding, although we had a good go. So, you know, there's not a shortage of things out there. I won't be scratching around for things to spend the money on, particularly with COVID, because so many of the groups who are doing good work are struggling, partly because the communities are struggling, you know, can't necessarily donate as much money to things. So that, yeah, we can help with that. So yeah, you told us you wanted to do more. That's our proposal for that. We'd like to, it's not set in stone, it's a rule of thumb. So, you know, I'm not going to spend it just because it's there. We can leave some till our following year until a better idea is there. And also, it's kind of it's a rule of thumb. We're not absolutely fixed with it, but it is useful to be able to plan a few years ahead, to know, particularly for the housing where we've got longer time frames because of planning and things, have an idea of what we can plan to spend. So you'll get to, you'll see the motion on that in a little while. Next slide, please, Sam. So there's a full list of what we awarded during 2020. So in the 2020 AGM, we voted on how much of the 2019 surpluses we would like to put to community funding. That was our 85-15 ratio. There was also some left over from previous years. So page 8 of our annual report lists everything we kind of allocated to beneficiaries. Some of it, the cash actually went out after year end. It does add up to more than the £86,000. That's because we were still spending some from earlier years as well. So it's not that I can't count. I'd like to just kind of pick a few to tell you about. There's also a breakdown in the annual report of what all those community grants were, and links on the website. If you look in the news heading, you can find a link through to everything. And I know some of you already put comments on the website. That's great. Okay, so I'm just going to kind of canter through a few examples just to give you an idea. There were more on the videos and slides in the break time. So we set, I've mentioned, we give them 25,000, which is for them to spend on their core funding, just running things, all their day-to-day stuff that they do. Wind also make a contribution. If they have a specific project, we're happy to consider funding that as well. So we've paid towards, this is the second tranche, I think, towards their schools' educational materials, which look fantastic. Take a look. We also, as you know, and you'll have heard Mike say that there's a big ongoing project to try and get visitor facilities on the site, the Westmill Centre project. And he did say it's hard. It's actually harder than putting up the wind turbines in the first place, maybe. So in the past, last year, I was telling you we'd helped get the project started, pay towards planning. This year, we decided, with such uncertainty and with one of the big funders being EU, with a real time limit under the transition on getting the money out, we wanted to help make sure it happened and that we were going to get value for money for us and Westmill Wind contributing to that. So you'll see quite a bit of that. There was project management support to make sure our money's spent wisely. It hasn't happened yet. It's going to have to go through a different incarnation, but we're still hoping to fund that in the future. We had some grant applications from schools. We awarded to one that's just up the road in Highworth. They've got a great idea where the students vote themselves each year on a project they want to do, what they call their leadership activities. And this year they chose the environment and applied to us for some money to help them do some practical things along that line. And then they've got a small cohort of students who are not so academically able, but they wanted to help them with some life skills. So they bought bits of equipment and things with our funds to help them learn practical skills in horticulture. So that sounded like a really good example. Next slide, please, Sam. So slightly further afield, you'll have seen on the video maybe Oxford Farmhouse Kick. They collect up apples that would otherwise rot and have apple pressing events. They also train a program to get homeless people into a work environment, helping with these kinds of things. They could not reuse their bottles under the current regulations with the equipment that they had. So a relatively modest grant from us meant they've got a bottler and a bottle washer, and they can now reuse those, which is far more sustainable, and they're very happy. Okay, next slide, please. Oh, no, sorry, back one. I missed one, didn't I? So at the top of that slide, we fund through Low Carbon Hub free energy audits for community buildings. So schools, scout huts, that kind of thing. You can nominate a building to get one of those free energy audits. Please do. There's a form on the website. You can pass it on or get your favorite building organizers to download that and do that. We've funded quite a few this year. That's an ongoing program. Thanks. Next slide, please, Sam. So I hope you saw Charlie Luxton's talk. That was really good. And over the last couple of years, we've been talking a lot about sustainable housing and sustainable buildings. I have said that we're working with One Planet Oxfordshire and their zero carbon housing group. We haven't spent any money on that this year, partly because they're grinding slowly through planning with a small number of sites, partly because COVID has slowed that down even further. So what we have done is spent a lot of time. So for example, I've been introducing people. Abingdon and Whitney College are going to work with Green Corps on apprenticeships once the programs get started. And we wanted to see how we could help with that. And the first thing was just to get them talking to each other. We may well be able to help sponsor some apprenticeship, get some skills and jobs in the local area. That's not going to happen just yet. So we looked a bit further afield and we found the Prince's Foundation. Their building craft program, and you probably know Prince Charles, all of his activities have a strong kind of sustainability theme to them. So they have this program where they take people with some existing skills and then really emphasize the kind of traditional methods, sustainability. They get a chance to practice usually on some heritage buildings. So they had a project last year at Gloucester Cathedral, for example. So we talked to them about various ways that we could fund, and in the end we put in a lump sum to be used across the whole cohort. It seemed to be the best impact. And it turned out that one of the people who joined this program in the 20 to 21 cohort is from Wiltshire, so that's great. So he's a local for us. They sent us some great detailed reports. We'll put links on the website, but some quotes from him about what he learned about reusing materials and sustainable methods. Ideally, we'd love to get someone like Sam come along. I mean, they might next AGM in person be able to come along. They also had a previous person who'd set up their own sustainability business, and he was going to come last year had we been able to hold the AGM. Okay, next slide, please. Finally, I really, really want to echo Tom's plea. We want the members more involved. So yeah, you can nominate a community building for a free energy audit. You can recommend a community grant. So that grant scheme was successful last year. We've got a lot of positive feedback. So we're running it again. It'll open up soon. Watch the website. I would say beginning of July. You can, if you've got a relevant organisation, apply for a grant. Happy to say that. We like to see a member's name on the form saying this is the Westmill Solar member who put us up to this. That would be great. We also have a small panel of people who assessed all those applications and ranked them and decided which ones we really wanted to fund and made the recommendation to the board. And so I'd like to thank everybody who served on that this year, and to invite anybody else who is interested, please get in touch, the usual email at the bottom of the slide, and come and help us decide what to spend the money on. If that's not your thing, any other way, send us suggestions. If you've got a comment about whether we should have a local to members and not just local to the site, if you think there's another theme we're not covering, if you think there's something we're missing on fuel poverty that we could be doing, whatever it is, send us suggestions. If you've got community funding in the subject line, it will make its way through to me in the end. Sam will farm all those out. Okay, thank you very much, and thank you for your generosity in allowing all this funding to be spent on these good causes.
Thank you, Nina. That's fabulous. I think demonstrates the amount of work that's been done over the past few years, to be honest, to get this up to a sort of consistent, sort of steady state system. And it's great to see how the benefits of that are all sort of beginning to come through. And I think that, yeah, that's really one of the things for future people, face-to-face AGMs, actually meeting some of these people who were helping and spreading the message. And, you know, it may be that we invest as a cooperative in other co-ops, as we have done with Brighton and Hove and with Reading Hydro, and we can learn from those, and we can do it together with Westmill Wind, who've now set aside a reserve for similar sort of things. So per Nina's comment about involvement, you know, community grant is one area. There are lots of other areas where we're crying out for help, and I'm sure the members are both enthusiastic and phenomenally well qualified to help us with this. So if you do have a bit more time, and I think about 20% of you said in the member survey that you did, then we'd love to hear from you on that. So I'm going to pass over to Andy now to sort of summarize.
Are there any questions on the community funding, or do you want to take those later on?
Yeah.
Josh?
I mean, I think there was one point that was maybe raised by Penny Shepherd in relation more to sort of community funds, and that, you know, is there a risk around those funds being directed into areas that are already getting quite a lot of support because they're already highly engaged around climate change, partially because the numbers of members of community energy organisations are in those, likely to cluster into those areas which tend to be more greener politically, maybe. I wonder if it's a question about how is anything being done with the community funds to try and make sure that there isn't that over concentration. And maybe Penny, come in if apologies if that's not quite what your point was, but
okay. Yeah, so I talked about looking at potential impact and also looking at leverage. So we do sort of ask particularly on the grant application form, what is this part of a bigger project? What fraction of the overall thing is it? What other funding do you have and are you seeking? And certainly some of the grants, climate change was a kind of an add-on. It wasn't a key part of what they were trying to address. So the panel tended not to rank those highly, where it looked like they were just trying to get a bit more money into a pot that was already there. Yeah, we also try to be very careful where we've got a sort of let's say an amateur community group applying for something, as opposed to somebody else who clearly got an experienced grant writer. It was all very swish. So actually 3 of us on the panel have experience of various different settings of academic or whatever grants. So we tried very hard to sort of see through that, to look behind it, to see who was applying and what kind of situation they were in, regardless of how beautifully it was presented. If we're asking about whether we might go, let's say, other local communities nationally in future, that is a good point. If there's groups in Brighton Hove, we've got quite a few members around there. We don't necessarily want to be adding money when they've already got Brighton Energy Co-op and BHS Co and so on. But if they applied for a grant, we should see that they've already got 4 or 5 other pots of money, or they've applied for. And we would weigh that up when we're deciding whether we want to fund that grant or something that's perhaps more able to benefit from our money. So I hope that addresses the sort of aspects of that question.
I think that was a really good response, although I didn't quite cover Penny's point, which is more about national funding, going to areas where there are clusters of members. But I think your response was really useful in explaining how you sort of grade those grant applications.
Okay, great. So yeah, actually, sorry, I've just seen that in the chat. So hopefully my last comment addresses that. I think it would never be a huge amount of our funding. It was just whether we want to enable that for some members as well.
Brilliant.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you,
Great.
Nina. Thank you, everybody, for the questions. Andy, over to you on the finances.
Thank you very much, Tom, and good afternoon, everybody. It's been a long meeting. So I'm a new director. I was elected last year with a finance hat on. This is my first AGM. And I'd like, obviously, to claim the credit for an exceptionally good year for the co-op. And unfortunately, I can't do that because it really had nothing to do with me at all. The accounts in the full AGM pack, which you've already had access to, I have fielded some questions already by email. If we could have the next slide just to go through the summary. It's a very brief summary because I don't want to bore you at this late stage in the day with too many details. Taking it pretty much line by line, then you'll see that our income is around 10% higher than the previous year, which itself was above average. That is mostly, as Martin alluded to earlier, as a result of the excessive amounts of sunshine that we had last year, but also as a result of inflation increases on the FIT and improved power prices. Our admin expenses are down dramatically, and that won't be repeated. I guess there are three main reasons for that. One is in 2020, we had a rebate on our business rates that was backdated for several years. That was a £64,000 reduction in our expenditure, in other words, a negative expense. We also wrote back around about £48,000 worth of the legal reserve that we'd created previously in order to, when we had the capital repayment through the LPPI, we imagined that we'd have to pay legal expenses, which never materialised. And finally, in 2019, there were some exceptional expenses relating to that those changes in the loan agreement, which obviously weren't repeated in 2020. So altogether, and those have resulted in much less admin expense than you would otherwise expect. At members' interest, we're holding level at 12%, which equates to £486,000, essentially the same as the previous year. As Nina has said, we've put in 121,000 into the community fund. On the bond issue, there was a very large expense the previous year as a result of the change in the capital. That's not been repeated. And as a result of all those things, the retained profit is an astonishing £583,000, which is our best year, I believe, for ever. Cash in the bank is 2.1 million, and our loans have reduced to just over 7 million. Obviously, the accounts have been audited. We've got a clean bill of health. I'm happy to take any general questions. I'm hoping Sarah Flood might be in the meeting as well, who works for ethics and actually prepares the accounts. I'll try and field any questions that I get. So please go ahead and ask.
So we've got one question that's come in, which is, do you expect any significant impact from the proposed increased rate of corporation tax?
I don't. Obviously, we don't know what the rate's going to be, but we'll obviously be paying. We will have to be paying the rate that is applied. It remains to be seen what that rate might be. It's difficult to answer the question any other way, really. We pay the tax that is due. We'll have to see what the government does.
Any other questions for Andrew? Doesn't look like anything else is coming through.
That's brilliant. Thank you, Josh. Thank you, Andy. Much appreciated.
Okay, thanks.
No, it's been, as I say, it's been a great year, and thank you for sort of picking up and elaborating that so eloquently. The next set of resolutions, as I said at the outset of this, are slightly extended from what we have done in the past. And there are two reasons for that. One is because we have had a bumper year. and we felt it was as good a time as any to consider what we should do with the sort of, I wouldn't call them excess profits, because that makes them sound like it's unfair and they've been exploitative, but the profits over and surpluses over and above what we had anticipated. And that is the primary reason for trying to ensure that we have put in place a development reserve, which will enable us to kickstart some of the strategy ideas that have been discussed about earlier. They're in a specific order too. So under our rules, we have first to consider what we need to set aside for the development of the cooperative. Secondly, to determine what an appropriate rate of member interest is. And thirdly, and it's interesting that it comes after we've decided what the rate of interest is, to work out what allocation we should do for our community funding and other social and charitable purposes. So this was reflected in the survey. So the idea that we would increase the amount of community funding, we want to still tie it to the overall level of surplus, as Nina alluded to earlier. But we felt that there was, the proportion could be slightly increased over not just for 2020, but going forward for the future. And as Nina said, that is not although members were generally very supportive in the survey, that is not an answer that is set in stone. It gives us a guideline for certainly the next couple of years, and it's very much something that we will keep under consideration going forward. Before I hit those resolutions, Josh, I'm just flicking through the chat. It looks like there's a couple of questions coming in. So
yeah, that's right.
Deal with those.
Yes, so we've got a question on what is the rationale for keeping members' interest the same as in previous years, given what an exceptional year it was last year in terms of production?
Well, I think the straight answer for that is we think 12%. We, and I would say that as a board, and we went out to members specifically with this question on the survey. We think that is a good, not just a reasonably good, it's a very good rate of interest. It is quite a high profile figure. So in the context of some of the discussions that we've had, or haven't had discussions with the FCA, but some of the internal discussions we've had when we're looking at what the FCA might be considering, to have a particularly high rate of interest puts us more clearly in the line of fire potentially, and that's something we are wary of. But ultimately, we want to try and make sure that we give members something that is broadly based on what we set out in the share offer document, subject to the changes that members are happy to do subsequently. So that's fundamentally the answer to that question.
Okay, and then there's another question. There's a sort of follow-up from Penny on the tax bill, just to clarify on the corporation tax. There's a shift from 19% to 25%. So obviously there's there is going to be a 6% higher cost as a result of that. So that's just a clarification.
Yeah.
And then there's a question from Sarah James asking, can you give some explanation of how the figures in the resolutions are arrived at? Sure.
So the motions 3 and motions 4, in terms of the interest figure and the community funding, they are reasonably straightforward. So they are 12p per share equates to £485,683. And if you do the 80-20 proportion, the figure that comes out for community funding is 121,000. The figure in motion 2 is a slightly more arbitrary figure, if I can put it that way, in that if you looked, as Andy mentioned, when we did just the bond issue and the capital repayment back in 2019, we incurred nearly £500,000 worth of costs in various ways, some of which are just costs that we would have had to pay later on and have been accelerated. So we started from a point, I think, that said, even if our only strategy is to do another type of bond issue or something like that, we're going to actually potentially spend quite a lot of money quite quickly. If we have a battery storage project, that is likely to cost considerably more than £500,000. I don't think going forward that we will make the surpluses in future years at this level and be able to put as much into the development reserve every year. But I think the board felt that it was very much appropriate when we can to set money aside when we've got it, and then work with members to work out how we want to spend it, rather than not put that money aside and then have a good idea and not have any money to do anything with it. So again, that's the reason for that.
Okay, and there's a question from Jill. Can Energy for All or Westmill ever enable investments which can be included in ISAs, please?
Well, Westmill Solar's bond issue in 2019 was, and I think if we did something similar, we would try and make that happen again. So, I mean, that's one of the advantages, to be honest, of working with FX, because they obviously know these things and are using them on a regular basis, so that we benefit from that expertise.
Okay. And I guess, I mean, just to finish off Sarah's point, is kind of counterpoint to the previous one about the interest rate, asking why it was set at that higher level, saying it's
Yes, well, that's it's broadly, and I emphasise the word broadly, it's broadly consistent with what we had set out in the 2012 share offer document. And I think what we've done with the strategy is probably, if you look at the last we've been going nearly 10 years, we've probably, I think it's fair to say, overperformed generally in the first 10 years, and we expect some of that overperformance to continue. And by trying to do more collectively and put more into the strategy and long term and extend the life of the site and do things like that, the returns will not continue to rise as steeply as it has been anticipated in the share offer document. And that was, as I say, that was one of the key issues that we wanted to start that conversation with members in the member survey. And as I say, the feedback that came back from that was interesting. Again, they're not written in stone, but very broadly, we got a resounding vote in favour of keeping it at 12p this year. I think roughly by a 2/3 to 1/3 majority, people thought that it should continue at 12% going forward. And I think 1/3 of members reckoned that actually maybe we should reduce it even further. So that is an ongoing discussion that we will have, but it's interesting to see the variety of views that we've got amongst the membership on that.
Okay. And Andrew's asking if he could just clarify something. So...
Sure. Go ahead, Andy.
Yeah, I just wanted to, the answer to the first question, Tom, you're quite right. You mentioned the FCA, and for those of us who are listening who don't know what FCA is, it's the Financial Conduct Authority, who are the regulator, or a regulator, and they certainly have been looking at cooperatives and the sorts of returns that they are paying, and certainly in some instances, which we're aware of, have not been terribly happy with rates of return that are too high.
Thanks, Andrew.
Thanks, Andrew.
Apologies for acronym.
There's another question. There's a question about whether or not there are any plans to reduce the loan that Westmill holds.
Well, I think that's one of the things we'll take into account when we're thinking about the capital reduction, because we could reduce members' capital, or we could reduce LPPI capital. They're very happy to be a partner with us. They are their local council pension fund, so their involvement is quite relatively it was pioneering at the time, and it hasn't maybe been followed up as much as we'd want. So I think there are some constraints with it, but there's also some benefits with the relationship. So that is something that we will take into account as we carry on that discussion about capital needs generally.
Okay. And earlier there was a question around the capital return, which you said you were going to come to later on, Tom.
Yeah.
Is this the time now for that?
Yes. I don't, as I said at the start, we don't yet have a firm view on what we should do with the capital return. I think the default position is that we would normally expect to make a 10% repayment, which is what we did back in 2017. We might want to keep some of the capital. We might want to make it voluntary. We might want to look at different proportions of capital between LPPI, between members, between new members in particular. So all of those options are on the table, and to be honest, one of the key agenda items for the next board meeting is to actually look at that in more detail, after which we will go out to members and say, this is the sort of direction we think we should be heading. What do you think? And get some feedback and consensus on that.
Okay, and there's a sort of a more detailed question on the official papers, but I think Sarah has come in and answered that actually in the chat. Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks, Sarah. Okay.
And I think that's it for the moment, Tom.
That's brilliant. Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Thank you for the questions. Thank you for all the views that are being expressed too, because they are something that as a board, it's important that we're reflecting as many views as we can and developing a consensus. So if there aren't any other questions, I'm going to move ahead with the next batch of motions. Could Sam, motion 2 is to approve the allocation of £500,000 to a development reserve for the continuation of the cooperative and furtherance of its objectives. Sam, if you could open the poll, that's great. Thank you.
Launched now.
I didn't ask for a seconder, so
we'll take that.
If somebody wants to put their hand up as a thank you, Mark.
Thank you, Mark. Give people a little bit more time, maybe another 5 seconds. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Brilliant. So I'll just get those up now. So you should now be able to see the percentages there. I'm sorry that you can't actually see the numbers, but we have 24 for, known, 0 for against, and 0 abstaining. 2 abstaining, sorry. And then if we go to the resolution 2, there are the votes that were taken ahead of the AGM. So on that basis, I believe that motion can be passed.
I agree, that resolution is passed. Thank you, Sam. Should we move on to motion 3, which is to acknowledge the director's decision to pay share interest of £485,683 to members, being a payment equal to 12% return on member share capital. If I could have a seconder for that, please. Anthony Woolhouse, thank you. And go vote.
Okay. That seems to come in very quickly. So 5, 3, 2, 1. So I'll just share the results from that. So again, 22 people were for that, 3 against and 2 abstaining. And if we take that into account with votes taken before the AGM, again,
we can declare that resolution passed. Thank you. Could I ask, and you might not want to do this, the 3 who voted against, there is a nuance there between some who may think it's too high, some who may think it's too low, or some who just think it's wrong for some other reason. So at some point, and you may not want to do it on the chat, it would be very interesting to understand a bit more behind those answers, but I'll leave that as it is for now. Motion 4 is to approve the allocation of £121,405 for social or charitable purposes within the community served by the cooperative. If I could ask for a seconder for that, please. John Smith, thank you. Sam, if you could open the poll.
Polling open.
Thank you. If those who haven't already voted, thank you.
Is it 3, 2, 1? So I'll share those once again. So again, majority 4. We seem to be getting an abnormal number of votes coming in terms of count, so I will be reverting back to these again. But as of the results, there is 25 votes for, 3 against, and 0 abstaining. And there are votes before the AGM.
Thank you, Sam. And on the basis of those and voting as chair in favour, I can declare that resolution passed as well. Motion 5 is to receive and adopt the accounts and auditors report for the period to 31st December 2020. Again, if I could ask for a seconder. Ian, thank you very much. And Sam, if you could get the poll running.
Poll is up.
Thank you. And if those who haven't already voted could now vote, that would be great.
So 3, 2, 1, and that's the voting ended. So I'll get those, share those with you again. So again, overwhelming support. 25 people voted for, 0 against, and 2 abstentions. And there are the votes before the AGM.
Which again, voting as chair in favour, I can declare that resolution passed. Thank you, everybody. Motion 6, slightly different to our normal, we'll just authorise, appoint auditors. Together with Westmill Wind, we felt it was a good time to review our audit provision. Critchley's have been really good, I think it's fair to say, the last couple of years. And I think we value what what they've done, but we obviously want to make sure that we're getting value for money and making sure that there aren't potentially other people out there who could do as good or better a job for less. So we are proposing to conduct a tender process in conjunction with Westmill Wind. We won't necessarily end up with the same auditors, but I think it would be good if we could, because that's part of the whole process of working more closely together. And I think most of the problems and issues that we face are very, very similar. So the motion 6 proposal is to authorise the directors to conduct a tender process for the role of the cooperative's auditors and to finalise the appointment of the auditors following such tender on such terms as the directors consider appropriate. If I could have a seconder for that, please. Mark, thank you very much. And Sam, if you could open the poll.
Polling is now open. And in 3, 2, 1. Okay, well, that one is very straightforward, so I'll share the results, but all in favour.
Thank you.
Fantastic. And results, again, from before the AGM.
Brilliant. I declare that resolution passed. So that's the finance resolution sort of sorted. The last element of the meeting is for the re-election, actually, of a couple of our existing directors. As is good governance, there is a periodic requirement to sort of be re-elected by members. Both Mark and Martin, you've heard from them, you know them well. They contribute hugely to the board. We're delighted that they're happy to stand again. As we mentioned in the report and accounts, Martin has lots of other stuff going on in his life and hopes to be in a position where he could step down from the board sort of over the course of the next sort of six to 12 months. So we are very keen to have any members who, particularly with the technical expertise and can sort of cover that side of what Martin has done so well, to take over from him. So a call out there for everybody, anybody who's interested to do that in due course. And we'd obviously like to give members the chance to sort of join a board meeting, get a feel for it, get to know what the role involves before you have to commit. So there's very much a little opportunity to sort of see how it goes before you commit to that. I'm not going to suggest that Mark and Martin sort of stand up and introduce themselves. I think they're well known. So unless people have questions that they would like to ask of them, I'm going to pause to see if there's anybody coming in. Then I was going to go straight into motion 7. which is to re-elect Mark Luntley to the board of directors. And Sam, if you could open the poll.
Can I have a second first, preferably not
Thank
Mark?
you.
Thank you, Sarah.
Thanks for picking that up.
No worries. And I'll launch the poll then now as well. So it's there for everyone to vote. So good round of 105, 4, 3, 2, 1. Mark, you seem very popular. 100% voting from the groups there. So that's 27.
And in advance?
Still very popular.
That's good. I can declare that resolution passed. Thank you. And finally, motion 8 to re-elect Martin Allman to the board of directors. If I get a seconder, please. Thank you. Ian and Sam, if you could open the poll on that.
Yeah. Launching now. Okay, and I'll close the voting in 3, 2, 1. Fantastic. And I'll show those again. Martin, also very popular.
Thank you.
0, 1.
With the pre-advance votes in, I'm happy to say, voting in favour as chair, I can declare that resolution passed as well. Thank you very much, everybody, for your voting. Don't rush off just yet, because I have two things. The first thing is just a practical, a very practical reminder. I think, as Nina has pointed out in the chat, we do offer members the opportunity to waive some of their interest payment in favour of the community funding, which is something that a number of members have done for a number of years. And there will be a form going out to all of you and all members, sort of reiterating that opportunity after the AGM. We also, as part of a shift in the registrar functions within FX, Westmill Solar's fundraising was so long ago, we don't actually have all your dates of birth. And financial regulation is now such that we need that information to be able to sort of process payments to you. So we will need either to ask you directly and or to go through some system whereby we can collect dates of birth in order to enable you to get transferred to the new software for the registry services and for you to receive your interest payments. So I'm just alerting you to that, because it is something that when the email comes through, if you sort of think, oh, I've done that before, I don't need to look at it, please do look at it, because if you don't let us have that information, it may delay, at the very least, your interest payment to you. And that's something, obviously, we need to make sure that the data is collected and processed and dealt with properly, and FX will be doing that on our behalf. So thank you for that. I also want to take the opportunity for a few thanks to people. Thank you, firstly, to all my fellow directors who put in a huge amount of time, sort of well beyond what is really, I think, expected and certainly remunerated. And as you'll have seen from all the presentations, you know, they operate the cooperative to a hugely high standard. And with a lot of effort and a lot of qualifications and a lot of quality. So thank you to all of them for that. Particular thanks to Mark, who embarrassed me by messaging me in the wind survey, but as my shared chair, as we've decided, we'll call that. And he's done he is really, more than anybody, the person who's brought the wind and solar operations closer together. He's on both boards, which is twice the workload to start with, and that warrants a big thank you. Charlie, I don't think is still on. Charlie Luxon is still not on, but I'd like to thank him, because I think his talk was very galvanizing, and I think that's exactly the sort of urgency, frustration, and emotional enthusiasm that we need to actually make the changes that as a society we need to do. I'd like to thank on a practical basis all the advisors and all the suppliers, BSR, people like that who do a lot of work that we never see the benefit of except on paper when we get good results. I'd like to give thank all to the AGM organisers, particularly to Sam and his colleagues at FX who've actually organised all of this with help from Energy for All and coordinating and making sure we don't trip ourselves up on the technology, and Nina, who has done the sort of the work around, a lot of work around the edges in trying to make sure, firstly in finding Charlie and making sure that it's a good event. There will be a questionnaire going out to everybody. I think last year there was a pretty clear preference in favour of some kind of hybrid, let's meet people and have the online option, and I think that is technologically feasible and certainly something that we look at going forward. But it would be lovely to see you all in the flesh, and it's been far too long since we've been able to do that. And thank you to all of you, because fundamentally this is a member cooperative. It's not a community benefit society, it is a member cooperative. And without your input and your involvement, and again, I would encourage you to get more involved in time, in any other way, in suggestions that you can. It is hugely, hugely appreciated. And at that point, we've overrun slightly, but it's still before 2 o'clock. So unless anybody has any final comments, I'd just like to say thank you and formally close the meeting.
Fantastic. Thank you, Tom.